Hello, everyone, and welcome to the special edition of Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I have two of my favorite guests on: Kurt Kemper from Dakota State University in eastern South Dakota, and Dave Nicandri, formerly the director of the Washington State Historical Society. Gentlemen, welcome both.
Thank you. Welcome. Happy to be here, Clay.
Good to see you again, Clay.
Now, of course, you are my two Red Barber correspondents. I don't know a lot about sports. I'm sort of fascinated from an anthropological point of view or from a cross-cultural point of view, but I'm not an avid weekly sports watcher, but I'm not an avid weekly consumer of television sports, and I have no child currently in any sporting activity whatsoever, although my daughter at Oxford has been getting into archery, which I don't think really counts. All right, so, Kurt, let me start with you. You have written a book called Before March Madness, The Wars for the Soul of College Basketball, one of the two books that really caught my attention. And the other thing I know is that Caitlin Clark of Iowa has now scored more points than any other person in the history of the NCAA, boys or girls. So, Kurt, pick it up from there.
So I can't admit that I am much of an expert on women's college basketball. The book that I wrote focused entirely on the origins of the men's tournament. However, one of the things that my book does touch on is the way in which the NCAA has managed to slay all competitors. My book mostly focuses on the way in which they completely delegitimated the NAIA, the National Association for Intercollegiate Athletics, but I make brief reference at the end that the patterns that were learned in the 50s against the NAIA are also the exact same playbook that the NCAA utilized in the 70s against the AIAW, which was the Association of Intercollegiate Athletics for Women. And it's interesting that you should mention Caitlin Clark's record, because one of the ways in which the NCAA has historically delegitimated its competitors in the organization of collegiate athletics is to refuse to acknowledge the records of, and in fact, the championships of titles and players before the NCAA officially sort of seized control of women's sports. So, for example, no basketball titles in the 70s are recognized, even though it includes major powers such as UCLA. And Caitlin Clark's record was only, the first record they acknowledged that she broke was against the University of Washington. And it's only until recently that Clark has kept scoring that the media and all the rest of us can openly acknowledge that she's the most prolific scorer in all of major college basketball for women. But the NCAA refused to acknowledge the breaking of the AIAW record from the 70s. And so those are the kinds of things that have marked, unfortunately, the way in which the NCAA has operated more like a trade association in protection of their memberships and their trademarks and their mission statement. And it has not, in my opinion, served well the larger interests of college sports.
How important is Caitlin Clark's apotheosis? How important is it that she's attractive, she's poised, she does great interviews? She either has a natural talent for media or someone has taught her very well how to do all this. She seems like an almost perfect embodiment of what we want to admire. Is that fair, Kurt?
Well, yes, if I may paraphrase William Shakespeare, let me count the ways. For starters, she's good. In fact, she's damn good. As we just pointed out in the previous section, she is the most prolific female scorer. In fact, actually male now too. Caitlin Clark is the greatest player that any of us have seen almost certainly in our lifetimes. So that matters when you're looking at commercializing and commodifying women's college basketball. Two, she is in general more or less an admirable, likable character. If you're not an Iowa fan, you may not care for some of her court antics, but her histrionics and braggadocio is nowhere near on the scale of the men's players. And as sort of a subplot, she's often seen as less confrontational as some of the other players, most notably her foil in last year's NCAA final, Angel Reese from LSU. In the listing of things that she does well and that make her admirable, no, that's not the right word, that make her marketable, the unspoken hidden thing that you did not mention but is the white elephant in the room is she's also white. When you look at the way in which female athletes are marketed, there is an unbelievable and quantifiable distinction that is chasmically different across racial lines. When we look at the way in which the products that are often offered, and in particular the dollar amounts, white athletes tend to benefit more from that. Angel Reese has sort of doubled down on that by embracing her blackness as something that she believes that many are not comfortable with. Paige Buchers, who is white at UConn, has explicitly acknowledged this chasmic distinction, and she has been very critical of it. And in fact, one of her shoe deals, I can't remember who the manufacturer is, but she had written into the contract that they would only sign her as an endorsed athlete if they would also make efforts to add to their list of endorsed athletes black athletes. So this is it's not a hidden issue anymore, but it is still an uphill fight. But it's something that Caitlin Clark has at her advantage.
Dave Nicandri, this just makes me sad to think that Caitlin Clark might be seen as the great white hope. That we privilege the white gifted athlete in a way that we just can't build quite the same enthusiasm for a talented black athlete. It's pretty late in the game for this still to be true, isn't it?
Well, I think Kurt, as is usual in these dialogues, has hit upon some pretty trenchant themes. Women's hoops, NCAA women's basketball has certainly come of age. And I think, to take a slightly different take on it than Kurt's, although I think you would both see that my take is compatible with Kurt's, one of the indicators that women's hoops has come of age is that for the first time in the history of the game, of the women's game at the college level, you have identifiable protagonists and antagonists, sort of like, if you will, the Magic Johnson, Larry Bird era of the early 1980s in men's NCAA basketball, which of course is when March Madness as we currently know it and understand it really does date to the Magic Johnson, Larry Bird contest. I think it was the 1981, spring of 1981 season. And of course, what is sympathetic with Kurt's take is that going into this postseason, I think it's fair to say that Caitlin Clark was the protagonist in this drama, and that Angel Reese, per Kurt, was the antagonist. Although, Kurt, before I go too much farther, I think it's interesting nonetheless that, and I'm not intending any pun here, but I think sort of the angelic characterization of Caitlin as opposed to the antagonistic demeanor of Angel Reese a year ago, Caitlin Clark's beginning to develop her own sense of edginess, even to such an extent that her own father from the stands has been giving her the cut sign to knock it off because she seems to be a little too argumentative, complaining about the refereeing a little bit too much. So there are many subplots to that, I suppose. But I think there's more of an edge to her game than was clear a year ago when clearly she was posed, within the racial context or not, as the protagonist in the drama, whereas Angel Reese at LSU was unquestionably being seen in a wide set of the sports media market as the antagonist. One last point, Clay, just for your benefit, referring to Ms. Clark. I just can't help, for the long listeners of our dialogues, I can't help but say, being a Clark, you can't keep a good person, you can't keep a good Clark down.
Yeah, a way to really take it into the gutter there. Dave Nicandri, he's talking about William Clark and George Rogers Clark. George Rogers Clark, the hero of the Revolution, Jefferson's almost favorite warrior, and then William Clark, one half of the great team of Lewis and Clark, 1804 to 1806. Kurt, we're going to go to a break here in a minute, but, about edge and so on, I get it. If I were the person who had scored the most number of points in college basketball ever, I would have some edge. I'd be pointing to my chest. I'd be preening. I'd be lording it over other people. Think of the male athletes, some of the most gifted male athletes in our recent history. Michael Jordan, for example, Magic Johnson. You could list 100 people that are household words, at least 50, and she's outscored them. She has every right to preen, it seems to me.
I tend to basically agree with you to a certain extent, and Dave's point is well taken. Last year's sort of, and I think I would imagine a lot of this was as an absolute media creation, this sort of controversy rivalry with Reese, but it was absolutely cast in racial terms by both sides, I think. Caitlin Clark is, as always, for those who follow her game, and I cannot say I have followed her game extensively, but she's a bit of a trash talker as somebody who is as good as she is, you would expect. I think the issue we're sort of dancing around here is the double standard in which we expect our male and female athletes to behave. We still want our female athletes to be female athletes instead of just athletes. And you're exactly right. I mean, if you have had a chance at all, if anybody's had the chance to watch The Last Dance on Netflix, which is the Jordan documentary, you see what kind of a ruthless competitor he is. And nobody blinks an eye at the fact that that's a male athlete. But when Caitlin Clark wants to gesticulate with her hand gestures and in any way perhaps draw some distinction that she's managed to vanquish an opponent, I think, we're sort of all up in arms. One of the things that I think with Clark that we're really sort of struggling to come to grips with is that she is not just a good female athlete, she is one of the greatest basketball players, regardless of chromosomes, we've ever seen. I read an article with her regarding her experience in high school. And she admitted, I mean, she wasn't lonely in high school, but high school basketball for her was very, very frustrating. And her high school coach made the comment, I really didn't know how to handle 4 kids who wanted to play high school basketball and then a white Kobe Bryant, and she's that good. And the fact that we don't want to acknowledge those kinds of people, whether it's in politics or sports or whatever industry, those people are unicorns.
We need to take a short break here. I'm sorry to cut you off. We'll be back. I want to ask you about what happens next for Caitlin Clark. This is one of my favorite things to do, to talk to Dave Nicandri, who's out in the state of Washington, and Kurt Kemper, who's in South Dakota, both experts on sport from different perspectives. This is a special edition of Listening to America. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Listening to America. Kurt Kemper and Dave Nicandri, my Red Barber correspondents on sports questions. We meet here about once every 6 weeks for a little discussion. We happen to be in the middle of March Madness when we're recording this, and Kurt is an expert on that. Dave, back to Caitlin Clark. Is it true what I read, that when she now goes to the pros, she's going to take a pay cut?
Yes, unquestionably so. This is one of the consequences of the name, image, and likeness revolution within the NCAA, itself a function of legal action, lawsuits filed by players who, as a class, saw university administrators, principally coaches and athletic directors, literally making small fortunes on the backs of the athletic endeavors of the students, whose only compensation, not that it was minimal, but whose only compensation was perhaps a free ride, a free 4-year scholarship to one or another college or university. I think the predominance of the women's college game over the men's college game at present is the fact that you see Caitlin Clark in advertisements during the broadcast of the games with State Farm, whose other principal spokesman for the other half of the year is no less than Patrick Mahomes, the best quarterback in professional football, 3-time champion with the Kansas City Chiefs. Also, for those who aren't totally tied into professional football, not coincidentally, I think it's relevant, Patrick Mahomes is an African American. So you have Caitlin Clark but you have the fact that she's on the same plateau with Patrick Mahomes, and given the popularity of the National Football League, that is truly rarefied atmosphere. That's playing above the rim, if you like, metaphorically, on the financial compensation level. She's probably not getting as much compensation as Mahomes, but she's in the same format, and that is truly remarkable.
Kurt, you were shaking your head a little bit about the pay.
Yeah, so this has been pretty well documented, and I don't criticize Dave here because there is a distinction that often many people draw from. So Dave is correct in the availability of name, image, and likeness money from these collectives. Caitlin Clark, however, takes no money from Iowa's nil collective. All of her endorsement money comes from, as he rightly pointed out, major advertisers like State Farm. She's got a deal with Buick. Here in the Midwest, there's a very profitable grocery chain called Hy-Vee that's about 5 or 6 states. She's a spokesperson for Hy-Vee. And I think some of that is an uncertainty of exactly what this new financial landscape for college athletics entails. There's a whole lot of people, some people believe the universities are running these collectives, which they're not and prohibited to at the moment. We don't distinguish between what the booster group collectives are paying them as opposed to these national sponsors. The way Clark is making her money is the way in which everybody originally envisioned the NIL rules allowing. In other words, here's somebody who, through her own acumen and virtuosity, has made herself into a household name and should thus be allowed to compensate or to be compensated for that. In other words, she's getting paid on the back end of work she's already done. The criticism of the NIL collectives is that those are really just pay for play. We want to fund the people who will come here and then hopefully do good things for us.
Am I the last person in the world who thinks the sentence she's going to take a pay cut or the sentence she's going to take a pay hike is in itself wrong? I mean, I know I'm living in 1932 here or 1951, but the idea of collegiate sports was character building, teamwork, giving people a place to spend their youthful physical energies, to learn something about grace, to be coachable, to be prepared as a better human being when they do the real work, which is to finish getting a college degree in something. I know I'm just sounding like a fairy tale here, Kurt.
So I disagreed with Dave. Now it's my turn to disagree with you. I think most of us who have consumed college athletics want to believe that's what we're watching because it allows us to distinguish between the professionals. In reality, college athletics at the major level has never been the world you just described. In fact, if you go all the way back to, I think it was 1853 is the very first intercollegiate athletic event between Harvard and Yale. It's a crew meet, and it does not occur anywhere near the campuses of Harvard and Yale. It actually occurs on Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire, and they've been paid by a real estate developer to go up and race each other in an effort to try to draw sales of real estate lots. We were paying players in the 1880s and 90s. And we've been engaging in various level of inducements from the jump. So the esteemed scholar who's now retired at Oregon State, a guy named Michael Oriard, famously described this as the irreconcilable sort of paradox of college athletics. It's the original sin that the minute we decided the most important thing was to win, then all the rest of the stuff, Clay, you just mentioned, it's not irrelevant. We'd like those things if we can get them, but we're not willing to give up winning to get the other stuff, but we're more than happy to give up that other stuff to win.
David Nicandri, I mean, some part of you at least hears what I'm saying and is drawn to that now discredited model. Does capitalism have to get its fingers on absolutely everything in America?
Well, it's seemingly so. I think Kurt has, I've read the first few chapters of Before March Madness, in which Kurt begins to lay out the long and entirely more complicated relationship between college athletics and financial remuneration and cutthroat competition between organizing bodies and the like. And it's a little bit like The Wizard of Oz reading Kurt, because more and more people are pulling back the curtain. And Clay, what you described is certainly the idealized understanding of how college athletics was supposed to be organized. Again, in Before March Madness, Kurt lays out this was kind of the early Northeastern, Ivy League, Upper Midwest, small liberal arts college way of looking at the world, whereas the big players, then and now, the Michigans, Ohio States, among many others, they took an entirely different posture and saw the pecuniary advantages to be derived from big-time college sports and paying players in one form or another. In fact, there's a new book out on it's called Kingdom on Fire by a Scott Howard Cooper. I'm not sure if either of you are familiar with that. It's on the John Wooden era, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who, of course, when he played for Wooden, was known as Lou Alcindor, thought about leaving UCLA for greener pastures, and is quoted in this book as saying, once the money thing got worked out, he's referring to Sam Gilbert, who's the legendary paymaster, bagman for all things UCLA athletics. Once the money thing got worked out, I never gave another thought to leaving UCLA. So this has always been a part of the backdrop of big-time college athletics, far from the golden ideal you laid out, Clay, and more people, Kurt being primary among them, I dare say, were kind of laying bare the hypocrisy and the seedy underpinnings of the entire enterprise.
Kurt, back to Caitlin Clark. Extremely talented college athletes often don't do that well when they get to the professional level, for one reason or another. Let's assume that Caitlin Clark doesn't flame out, that she has a distinguished 5 or 6 or 10 year career, that she becomes the sort of Magic Johnson of the WNBA, that she lifts the sport into a higher profile in the United States, maybe helps to push up the salaries for WNBA players, which are often quite modest. Do you think that's what's likely to happen? And B, what do you think her long-term influence will be on basketball, professional and otherwise, in America?
Well, I will freely admit my ignorance. I am at best a casual observer of the WNBA, and in fact, even though I have written a book on the history of college basketball, as a technical element, I never played the game myself, so I don't pretend to be able to interpret, the skill and mechanics that she develops. But from what I have read from others, I think it's reasonable to assume she's going to have a better than average pro career. She can literally score from anywhere in the offensive half of the floor, which means, among other things, they're going to have to pick her up at the half court line, which in any other, sort of athlete's game potentially shuts her down. One of the things that makes her so fearsome is that her ability to pass is almost unparalleled. For a woman of her sort of body stature, her ability to hit chest passes at 30 and 40 feet is remarkable to watch. And for those of us who like watching the artistry of basketball instead of, bodies banging down low and thundering dunks, that's really beautiful to watch. The point of that is, somebody's going to have to come pick her up at the half court level, and that's going to leave somebody open. So she's either going to lead the game in scoring or she's going to lead the game in assists, your choice. So I think that's probably what's going to make her a viable pro. Her long-term, I think, benefit is going to be the number of people who have now been forced to admit that women are playing real basketball. The Neanderthals who don't want to admit that women's basketball is appealing to watch have been exposed as essentially just that. And Steph Curry has shown in the NBA that we like watching guys hit from outside. You don't have to appeal to me simply by dunking. And that's been the age-old, almost sort of default misogynistic criticism of women's basketball is, well, they don't dunk. And I think most people have said, I don't care. So I think in terms of the profile that she's gotten, that's going to be a huge win. And I think the other thing, and then I'll cut it off there, is that because she's a fairly outsized personality, getting back to the point Dave made earlier, there will be rivalries with other players. And I think that will be good for the game for exactly the reason that Dave brought out, sort of the magic bird, Indiana State, Michigan State Final Four that I think was actually 1979. But the way in which Jordan went at, Isaiah Thomas or Karl Malone, that's the way North American sports fans interpret games that they otherwise don't have a rooting interest. Is they kind of want the soap operatic drama. And even if they want to root against somebody, they're going to watch them to do it. And I think that'll be what Clark's legacy is.
One bit about Steph Curry. He's great from outside. What amazes me, Kurt, is how much he gets inside and doesn't get stopped. That he gets to that basket for one form of layup or another with some frequency. Usually you would expect him to be pummeled because his size is not that great, but he's so quick and so unpredictable, and everyone thinks he's going to shoot the three, that he really has a marvelous inside game too. Dave, influence. I think at this moment there are 100,000 or 500,000 9-year-old girls who are asking their parents to get a basketball hoop outside, that this is going to turn on enormous numbers of young women to want to become basketball players.
Yeah, Caitlin Clark is a revolutionary figure in that regard, I think, without question. Other figures in sports history come to mind. Billie Jean King, for example, maybe Martina Navratilova. And certainly the Steph Curry allusion is appropriate because she has a game that evokes the way Steph plays the game, including the ability to make a pass. And in that sense, I think Kurt has very deftly changed the frame of reference for our conversation because Clark, as a kind of a transitional figure, revolutionary nonetheless, she has brought the women's game kind of at par with the best aspects of the men's professional game, and I make that distinction advisedly because one of the things that's worthy of remark in the present context is that the women's college game is more. I maintain, Kurt, you disagree if you must. I think the women's college game is more popular than the men's college game. I mean, you have the women's tournament on the main stem ABC network, while the men's tournament is relegated to the nether regions of the Turner Network and True TV, whereas the women's game is on ABC and ESPN, which are the high identified sports brand identifications. And the ratings for the women's game, women's to men in college, the women's ratings are also higher. So something is going on here that in a way, Caitlin Clark is representative of, but it also transcends her. And again, Kurt managed to shift us to it. And that is there's something about the way the women's game is played that the vast American sports watching audience finds more attractive than at least the men's college game.
Kurt, you disagree?
Well, so, I'm because I was actually looking at this right before we got on. The women's college basketball tournament, their ratings are more than double from last year. They're up 109%. However, and by the way, those are significant numbers because we're talking about an average of over 800,000 viewers per game, which I will point out is better than what ESPN gets for regular season NBA broadcasts. So in that regard, Dave is on to something here. Now, relative, though, to the men's tournament, no, they are not topping the men's tournament numbers yet. Certainly, they enjoy a prominence in the sense that ESPN is owned by ABC Capital Cities, and ABC is taking advantage of the Caitlin Clark phenomena, and they are putting games on free network, or what we call linear TV right now, and that is working to their benefit because of the ease of access. But in terms of the value of the contract, no, the women's tournament is not yet in the same stratosphere as the men. Interestingly, you should mention this, though, because the NCAA made a decision within the last 3 months that is very much displeased many of the movers and shakers in women's college athletics, is that when they put their television properties up for sale, men's college basketball is a single property to bid on. They put almost everything else in a single pile. So, for example, the women's basketball tournament is in the same product basket that you bid on wrestling and volleyball and the Men's College World Series and the Women's College World Series. And many people believe the NCAA has made a grave mistake there because they're undervaluing the product by not breaking it out. But the bigger issue that I think there's maybe even a sounder argument is this continues to reveal what is, in my mind, sort of a blind spot when it comes to women's athletics and the marketability in the North American sporting landscape. By saying that we're going to make you buy wrestling in order to get this, it diminishes all of these products as second tier, and I think that is a grave disservice that the NCAA is engaging in. However, in fairness to them, they're not the only ones who are missing the boat. Nike, if you look at the merchandising, I don't know how much time we've got to get into this. The way in which women's apparel is marketed is atrocious. Right now, if you look at the Iowa bookstore, the website to go buy apparel, you can get all kinds of Iowa-oriented spirit gear that make reference to Caitlin Clark and women's college basketball in adult larges. You cannot, however, get a Caitlin Clark jersey in a men's adult size right now. This happened about 3 weeks ago. So if you follow the NBA, there's a player named Drew Holiday. Drew Holiday is married to Lauren Holiday, who's a player on the U.S. women's national team. She's won a World Cup and 2 gold medals. And I would love to see what their family picnics look like if that's what their athletics are. But he shows up at an NBA game wearing his wife's jersey, except for it's her number, but it's actually a men's national team jersey because you can't get a women's national team jersey in an adult male size. And you know, Nike has missed the boat on this. They completely botched the rollout of the goalkeeper jerseys before the World Cup. You can now finally buy the jersey kits for the goalkeepers of the Women's World Cup that was 6 months ago. So the NCAA is not the only one that's undervaluing women's college athletics.
For me, this is kind of a depressing conversation. You know, marketing, sales of product by the NCAA, marketability, jerseys. I mean, it's all important. I get it. But we're not really talking about sport here. We're talking about what sport can be made to do in a late capitalist society. Does either of you know what Caitlin Clark's major is?
To ask the question is to answer it, Clint.
I
Asked and
I
answered.
believe it's economics, but I don't know that for a fact, or marketing. I can't remember which. I just read a feature on her, an extensive one on ESPN, and it did mention this, and I believe it's either marketing or econ.
Sounds good. So, Dave, we have to go to break here. I'll give you 30 seconds. What does your man, Mad Dog Russo, say about the Caitlin Clark phenomenon?
I haven't heard him talk a lot about it. I mean, sports talk radio has yet to catch up with the broader TV marketability and ratings phenomenon that Kurt and I have been talking about. Of course, that's a whole universe unto itself. There's local programs, national programs. There's not a lot of talk about it, so I can't vouchsafe for what Russo has said about it. I don't think an awful lot on his part. He's still pretty much wrapped up in the men's tournament.
Gentlemen, we need to take a break. There's so much more to talk about. I'm talking to Kurt Kemper of Dakota State University in eastern South Dakota and Dave Nicandri of the state of Washington, two experts often in the weeds about sports. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Listening to America. Kurt Kemper of South Dakota and Dave Nicandri of the state of Washington. Dave, you have a question for Kurt.
Yeah, one among the many evidences of the popularity of the men's game traditionally is the betting line. And I'm just wondering, Kurt, whether you've made a point of study or cognizant of any information regarding whether there is a betting line on the women's tournament. Clay, just for your benefit, I think it's generally conceded that one of the facets that drives the huge public interest in March Madness and the men's tournament is the ability to bet on the game. So what's the scene look like on the women's side, Kurt?
Well, the Vegas bookmakers absolutely lay lines and carry action on the women's tournament, and they have done that before this year. That's not a recent phenomena. But to be sure, the volume of bets has gone up markedly, and I think that's something else we can put in Caitlin Clark's totes. You point out one of the things that has allowed the men's tournament to become the equivalent of the Super Bowl. And what I mean by that is this is a cultural phenomena that even if you don't follow basketball at all, you sort of pay attention to it. And a key component of that is the ability to fill out an office pool, the bracket, the visual sort of symmetry of the bracket, the ability to just start, and the people who guess completely randomly, there we go, that's exactly. They honestly don't do any worse or any better than those of us who presume to think we know what the hell we're talking about. And that's an appeal, and that is driving, the betting element is what has made this such a phenomena for 25 years. And so that does exist for the women's tournament, just not on the scale that it does for the men's.
Fair enough. I understand the people around in the office looking at the pool, and maybe they agree to somebody goes out for dinner, or there's a bottle of wine, or they all put in $10 or whatever. That's not really what we're talking about now. I mean, this major betting in a kind of unprecedented way has come to sport, and there used to be resistance to that. Just think of Pete Rose, for example. Looks like the sluice gates have really opened on this front, and I will tell you personally, I'm going to sound like a medievalist once again. I find it very upsetting and off-putting. I think that it damages my sense of the game, and it probably actually damages the game too. Dave Nicandri, you first.
Well, it does seem to be accelerating, and it's only a matter of time, I suspect, before we run into a difficulty with the betting culture having an impact on the outcome of athletic contests. There was a period, and I'm sure Kurt is exceptionally more conversant in this than I am, but I remember as a kid hearing about the betting scandals in college basketball, early 1950s, I want to say, Kurt. And maybe there's a saving grace in the fact that now that these athletes are more unabashedly compensated than they were in the 50s, that they're not susceptible to throwing games. Of course, the most famous incident, of course, is the 1919 World Series, the so-called Chicago Black Sox scandal. So I think we're kind of skirting in on some or treading out onto some thin ice here. There's just so much money in gambling. All the leagues, colleges haven't quite got there, but the pro leagues have unabashed marketing alliances with the betting sites, which are only proliferating. I just see some shoals and rocks ahead on that front.
Now, Kurt, when I watch sports now, in the last 4 or 5 years, I've begun to see a lot of gambling ads right with the ESPN commentary. And there's crossover where I'm not sure whether it's programming or advertisement where they're starting to talk about betting pools and you can call now and so on. And there's been a kind of a porous loss of any demarcation between sports talk and sports analysis per se and the phenomenon of betting, which seems to be electrifying a lot of the nation.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. So one of the things that is a big part of this and that has broken down that sort of firewall that you speak of is the proliferation of for-profit fantasy leagues. And now ESPN and other media outlets now create content that is solely aimed at the fantasy process. In other words, they are not offering commentary on games actually played. They're attempting to create content on the way in which you are managing artificial content. Back to the point that both of you are making in the ubiquity of the gaming industry, which I will join you. I find it very off-putting and unappealing. But when you go to ESPN, if you go look on their scores screen, where so if let's say you're out mowing the yard on a Saturday afternoon, you want to come in, all right, what are the scores of all the college football games? And you go to that page. On that page now, they will blatantly include what the betting line is for those games in what is ostensibly historically been, for lack of a better phrase, a news page. Now it's including this ancillary content. So, and it's for all the reasons that Dave's pointing out. It's what's driving traffic, but it's also advertisers and corporate partners. And so the betting element is something that I think is only going to become more distasteful to some of us. Now that we're paying the players openly, or we're supposed to be providing them some level of compensation, I do think that that's entirely possible that we might cut into some of the incentive. Dave talked about the betting scandals, the fixing scandals in 1951 in college basketball. That was easily the most notorious incident, but back in the day when we were only giving kids, who were on scholarship, what was called laundry money, which was about $8 a week, I think, in the 50s. That's barely enough to get pizza and beer, in the 50s, and I don't know what the extrapolated is out for the 2020s. But certainly Caitlin Clark is not going to be incentivized to throw a game and ruin her reputation for $5,000 or $10,000 that a bookie would throw at her. I think some of those things are farther down the line. I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that we're going to be completely insulated from this.
So, Kurt, tell us a little bit about the effect of Title IX. I don't think that we would be having this conversation about Caitlin Clark if there hadn't been a gender revolution in collegiate sports a generation ago. Tell us how that's changed everything.
Well, it absolutely has, in ways that, honestly, the historical profession are still trying to figure out really how to measure it. We can look at some basic statistics. We look at participation, which is through the roof. I mean, it's like 800 times more than it was in the 70s. And for anybody who's younger than us, maybe this feels like ancient history, but I can tell you I'm 53 years old, and in 1977, I played in the Culver City American Little League, and my Little League team had the first girl in our Little League's history in 1977. So this is not, back in the dark ages. I mean, I guess it really is in some regards for some of us. But So this is an ongoing revolution in the sense that it's still happening in real time. The kinds of things we've been talking about, though, that Dave is getting at in terms of more to do. The way in which women's sports are perceived, the marketability of them, the way in which they're slated for broadcast. These are things that are still developing, but the way in the distance that we have come on this is absolutely of a benefit of Title IX, and I put it in maybe the most sort of naked sporting contests. If you have 100 people and you pick the best 5, then hopefully you got a pretty decent team. But if you've got 2 million playing and then you pick the best 5, you're going to have a much better best 5. And by broadening women's participation, we have elevated the skill levels that we see. Dave talks about the years of the NCAA tournament where there was 2, 3, and I think some years 4 was being generous on his part. The status of the women's Olympic team, the American women are now beginning to look like what the dream teams looked like in the 90s. Now we're really seeing the fruition of a generation of women playing highly competitive sports at an early level, at an early age, I should say. Now, whether that's good or not, in the sense that are we elevating women, or are we simply sort of ruining the women's game to look like the men's game, in the sense that it's now becoming nothing but victory oriented? For example, if you look at the entrance qualifications of female Division I athletes, they are declining. They are beginning to regress to a mean of what the men are. In other words, the trade-off for this excellent basketball that we're watching is that more and more and more of these athletes are devoting more and more of their private time to sports and not studies.
Indeed. And, I can't see that as anything but sad. I get it. I mean, I understand the dynamics. I understand the nature of American capitalism and our marketing system and the unbelievable multiplier effect of television, which has also changed sports, almost beyond recognition. But we still have a little hankering in our hearts for the coach that gets his students through with real degrees. We still like the idea of the coach who insists on real study and not just sort of manufactured degrees and so on. The idea of the scholar athlete is largely gone in American life, but we still, I think, feel some nostalgia for it and some respect for it, and so it's all a trade, right? Title IX, 1972, it's almost like 1492 in terms of sports. Remember back, Dave, when women played these games, but it was a lot of passing, a lot of set shots, not a lot of action. They were expected, going back to something that Kurt said, to show a kind of female deportment, or it was thought that they really couldn't be competitive in anything like the same way that their counterparts as males were. And what we discovered in the last 10 years is that's just not true.
Well, I remember my sister, who was the athlete in our family. Well, my older brother was the athlete, but my next older sister was also a great athlete, tumbler, gymnastics. She played high school basketball. This is the 50s again. And I don't know if either of you were familiar with the way the game was organized for women, but there was only one player who could cross the center line. In other words, the girls were considered so fragile that 4 players stayed on one end. In other words, they divided the team to either court. There was only like a midfielder who could cross the midcourt and pass the ball to a different set of girls because it was presumed they couldn't go end to end routinely. The visual attractiveness, the aesthetic of the modern women's game, which in a way Steph Curry and the Warriors kind of presaged at the professional level, but the ball movement, the open court, the shooting. So something's going well on the women's side. Something needs some work on the men's side.
Kurt, your response to that?
Yeah, I would say that I wouldn't say that something needs work on the men's side. I think that's David Stern's dream, is that the internationalization of the game has such that now the NBA, back to my analogy of the bigger the pool to choose from, and I think honestly the real sort of 3 or 4 steps down the line that we need to be keeping an eye on is if the NBA truly is becoming more and more national. That means the NBA is going to require or going to need to lean less and less on American college basketball. And if that no longer becomes the conduit to the NBA, then I think those people who make their living off of American college basketball should be immensely anxious about that.
And that would include the networks first and foremost.
Absolutely. The efforts of all of the professional leagues in North America have been to try to spread the game, as they would say it. But what that's going to do is challenge existing business models in terms of where they have achieved or acquired that talent. And certainly one of the things that has made major college athletics in the United States so attractive is that this has been the route to professional development if your profession is going to be in athletics. You made a comment a minute ago that I wanted to get back to, Clay. You said the days of the college scholar athlete are dead. They only are at the major college level. They do exist at some levels in Division II, definitely Division III. The difference is we don't want to lionize and heroize them for whatever reason. I think we're probably coming to a day soon where to play what we would now call college football, you don't even have to be a college student. So I agree with you in that regard, but I'm with you. I like the story of the kid who still goes to class and has got to manage to figure out how to manage both parts of his life and achieve success in both.
I remember watching ESPN a few years ago, and they were talking about a football game between, I think it was Harvard and Dartmouth, and they said Harvard 8, Dartmouth 2. And I lit up like, yes, that's what it used to be, right? And now it's a whole different universe. I want to ask you a kind of a delicate question. Kurt, you talked earlier about race. So Caitlin Clark is a white girl, white young woman, a marketer's dream, really has a great TV pizzazz. She's almost like manufactured for this moment. I don't know how she handles the incredible pressure of being Caitlin Clark, frankly. But there's definitely a race factor in the way we market sports in America. And if the networks or the league or the backers are really wanting almost a white versus black protagonist, antagonist contest to build drama, there's something very disquieting about that, isn't there?
Well, yes, in the sense that the entertainment industry in the United States, though, has always been willing to dance right up to and in many regards thoroughly obliterate those moral lines. I mean, if you look at the NBA in the 80s, that dynamic existed between Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. And there's been quite a lot of scholarship that looks at the number of fans who liked Larry Bird because it seemed like he was the only white guy in the NBA. And that dynamic has been exploited probably more than I can think of, but that's the most obvious one. So what we're seeing right now with Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark, I don't think is unique. In fact, they're just sort of using the same playbook and changing the proper nouns. I suspect that that's going to be less aggressive when both get to the WNBA, because I don't think it will be in the league's interest to create one as an antagonist. They're both outstanding basketball players. I think one of the things that has been a disservice in this dialogue about Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese is that it, as Dave correctly pointed out, it reduces Angel Reese as the protagonist, as the foil. She's an outstanding basketball player in and of herself and will almost certainly have an equally outstanding pro career. And so I'm deeply troubled in the way that she's been objectified as sort of, the faceless black foil to Caitlin Clark's angelic Midwest white girl personality. So I'm 53 years old, and multiple times in my life I've reached a self-satisfied sense of, I think we've reached a plateau here in race in America. And then at some point in my life, I'm like, oh crap, we've got so far to go. So I don't necessarily think that this marks any kind of horrible regression, nor does it indicate, though, that I think we're really that far, as advanced as we thought. It's unfortunate that race is a major dialogue in America, and we haven't yet figured out how to narrate it.
Yeah, thanks. Dave, I want you to get the last word for today's program. I'm the ignoramus in this conversation, so I can only name one female college basketball player, and that's Caitlin Clark. So there are millions of people like me that don't know much, but her name is popped. She's suddenly really hot, and there's crossover appeal. She's talked about on the regular news, and she's on late-night talk shows and talk radio and so on. Dave, there must be 300 elite women college basketball players who are thinking right now, I'm a really good basketball player. Why is she and she alone getting this amount of national attention? Doesn't it do a disservice to a whole range of people of extraordinary talent?
Well, the optimist in me suggests that this will, in fact, change for the better. I mean, there have been, I'm conversant. In fact, I just jotted down when I thought that dialogue might go this direction. Cheryl Miller, Sue Bird, Sabrina Ionescu, great college and professional women's basketball players. So I think what's unusual here is the highly elevated visibility of Caitlin Clark, where maybe at some risk of overstatement, but I come back to it because I find the juxtaposition remarkable. You saw nothing but Patrick Mahomes on State Farm broadcast last fall, and now we see Caitlin Clark with the same marketing apparatus for State Farm this season. I made a game effort to try to suggest that there was more to the legacy of Richard Nixon's administration than normally meets the eye, and I refer to the Clean Water Act, the Environmental Protection Act, but also it is his presidential signature on Title IX. So I just want to remind the listeners of Listening to America, when months ago Dave did his best to...
Oh boy, here we go. What a world of illusion we live in. I think the only thing that can make Caitlin Clark hotter is if she would date Taylor Swift, and I don't see that coming down the road. Gentlemen, thank you. We will meet again. To all of our listeners, we'll see you next week for another important edition of Listening to America.